Today on the Modern Motherhood Podcast from AllMomDoes, I'm your host, Julie Lyles Carr. I have to tell you, this next guest, when we got on the air together and started recording for this episode, I just felt like I was encountering someone who was a long-lost friend. I just immediately, have you ever had that happen where you just feel that heart connection with someone? That is how it was for me with this gal, and I cannot wait to introduce you to her. She is a children's book author. She is in active ministry. She lives in the Nashville area. Gorgeous, wise, fascinating. Today, my guest is Dorena Williamson.
Thank you so much for having me, Julie.
So tell us a little bit about you, about who you're married to, where you live, what the kiddos are like, all the things.
Oh, all the things. Well, gosh, how much time do you want me to take? I could talk about my people all day. I am so blessed to be married to my best friend, Chris. We will celebrate, gosh, I have to sit and count. We'll celebrate 27 years in December.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And we are still having so much fun. Marriage is so much more fun and meaningful than I knew going in. And it's also much more of a journey of faith than I knew when I signed up. So always want to add that tidbit in, but it's wonderful to do life together with Chris. And we have been blessed with 4 kids. And I say kids with quotes because they are so not kids anymore. Dante is our oldest, and he is the only boy of the crew. He's 24. And he is a manager with one of our local Chik-Fil-A. So we are a Chik-Fil-A loving family for sure. Mm-hmm. And then our oldest daughter, Krista, is 22 rather. And she lives in Brooklyn, New York. And literally 15 minutes ago, I got off the phone with her. She's so excited that an interview she had this morning, she got a job. And she literally, not to go way off course, but it was a reminder to all of us as we cried and prayed together that God is preparing things for us when we don't know it. Yes, and we just had a crying and shouting moment with her, and so thankful for technology that keeps us connected with her. She's in Brooklyn, New York. And then our next daughter is turning 18 this week, so my life will be all about birthday celebrating for Chase. She's about to head to college in a few weeks. So we are loving this season to prepare to launch another child. And she also works for Chik-Fil-A. So, that's why I said we're a Chik-Fil-A loving
You got it
family.
Going on. Loyal.
We got it going on. And 2 different Chik-Fil-A. So, we really love that. And then our baby, our miracle girl, Karis, is 14. And she is proud to be the tallest next to her big brother. So that's a huge rite of passage when you're your youngest child. And she's our miracle child. She was a very early preemie. So we are so grateful when we see her physical growth and her spiritual growth, just to see how far God has brought her. And she's just our living testimony in the house that God is able to do, Ephesians 3:20, immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine.
Now, how did you and Chris meet?
We met in college, and I love to tell people that it was not love at first sight. It was opposites repel. It was not even opposites attract. And so much of that really was, we were just coming literally from 2 different worlds. I was a preacher's kid, church girl, very proud and admittedly quite pious also about being a super little spiritual little star there. And he was a guy raised in Baltimore, rapper loving, and trying to be, kind of the big man on campus and decide if he really wanted to walk with God. And it just did not draw me at all. He was not anything like what I would envision the guys that I would date. But God did a work in both of us. And when we met my freshman year, we had met when I was a prospective student visiting the school. But when we reconnected my freshman year, I saw the hand of God on him, and I saw that God had done something in him. And we became good friends. We did ministry together. We were part of a big group that prayed together and hung out together. And over a course of a few months, the Lord just made it really clear to both of us that there was something special there, and we dated all through college and got married after I graduated and he was finishing seminary, and then moved to Nashville as newlyweds in the summer of 1992 to pursue his Christian rap career with their record company here in Nashville. And we moved here to soar, and God's plan for us instead was to move here and for everything to fall apart. And but so often, you learn the same lesson sometimes more than once as you walk with the Lord, because we are children. We are his children. And when you're raising children, it's good to be reminded that we are also his children, and we continue to walk by faith. And so we moved here to Tennessee, and everything fell apart, and we questioned why God would lead us along a path like Jesus being led into the wilderness by the Spirit. We knew God had led us here, but it felt like we were in a wilderness. And after a few years of finding some places to serve locally, God began to reveal that he had in fact moved us to Tennessee to plant a multicultural church and to do something that we'd never envisioned. I certainly didn't sign up to marry a pastor when I married Chris. I had a good PK experience, so that was not on my horizon.
Did that check the box? Done. Yeah.
Exactly. And Chris, having gone to seminary, thinking he would, aspire to be in ministry, but certainly, youth pastoring or something like that, never, ever wanted to pastor, and absolutely never wanted to start a church. But when God calls, you either say yes or you say no. And he made it very clear that he was calling us in this Civil War town as an African-American couple to do something that was unprecedented and something that we had not seen. But he was very faithful to call us, and he's continuing to be faithful to do the good work that he ordained. So we're laboring in this vineyard, him as a pastor, me as a first lady, and leading. And by the grace of God, I can say that I also loving the ministry that he's called us to.
I love that it was so intentional that you were starting a multi-ethnic, multicultural expression of the church. And that is somewhat unusual. I mean, the stats tell us that unfortunately, the church remains very polarized many times along racial lines. So how did God make that clear that that was what you were supposed to be doing? How did you know that this was something you were going to step into? Because this was previous to a lot of the conversations that we're having now today. So how did that happen?
I love telling the story because it's a reminder that this really was God's work. It was absolutely not our great idea. We were able to connect in 1993 with a church here in Franklin called Christ Community Church. And Christ Community is a PCA, Presbyterian Church in America. And Chris and I both were raised Baptist. And we found this church through a mutual connection. They had begun feeling really convicted by God, largely through the ministry of John Perkins, one of the fathers, I say, of racial justice, modern racial justice. John Perkins' ministry out of Mendenhall, Mississippi. He had really impacted this largely white church and very wealthy church. And they had begun to minister in their local Jerusalem to the people that were close to their church. And that happened to be mostly African American and mostly low income. And they faithfully did that for a year, going into the neighborhoods. And later on, they would come to realize that they were also doing what sometimes white churches have done, and that is sort of being like a white savior. We'll come in, we have resources, we can fix up homes, and we can take kids to camp and do all of these enrichment things out of a really good heart. But at the end of the day, we're not living in the community with the people, and we're not incarnating. We're just sort of taking them out, bringing them, assimilating them into our world, and then letting them go back. Mm-hmm. And after a year of doing really good work, but also coming to realize some of those things, they began to pray that God would join specifically a black man to their work, because they were not getting to really touch the young black boys. And in that year that church was praying, that's when Chris and I got married, moved to Nashville, lost a record contract, scratching our heads, saying, God, what are you doing?
What is going on?
And just like we walked with our daughter, 30 minutes ago, as she is having her own journey of faith. God is working when we don't see it. And as we walk with him, as we say, God, I'm going to trust that you're doing something. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to trust that you're leading. And we connected with them, began to have a heart for the ministry that they were doing. And as a young married couple, we did not even realize that we were also being a role model to a lot of the kids in the neighborhoods who shared many years later with us that they had only seen Black married couple on TV with the Huxtables. They had not interacted with a young married Black couple, and representation is so important in all our ethnic communities. And for a lot of these kids, we didn't know as a young couple just trying to walk with God that we were also modeling what it meant for a husband to love his wife, and for when we grew our family, it was amazing the things that God revealed to us. And so in a 2-year period of walking with kids and discipling kids, and that grew to discipling parents. And then, we're a part of this largely white church, and Chris is preaching, and his gifts are making room for him. And I'm on the worship team and getting to sing with not only the kids when they would come to this church, but also a lot of, Christian musicians in that church. And so God was just very organically connecting these worlds that would not have interacted before without this Spirit-led, very step-by-step, living life together sort of interaction. And out of doing that ministry in that combination for a 2-year period, we just began to see what a representation of the kingdom of God it would be for a church to minister to people that was multiracial, that had people of different races a part of it, people of different economic backgrounds, people who voted differently, who come from different denominational expressions. And this was just all things that I could see how God led my journey as a pastor's kid, growing up in a family that certainly experienced people of different races and missionaries and ministering around the world. I could see how God put into practice literally in the steps that he was guiding for Chris and I. And so we said yes to something that we couldn't have imagined in September of 1995. And this church started out. And by the grace of God, it is continuing to display and experience God's diverse kingdom here in our local Nashville, Tennessee area, and also around the world.
Just beautiful. Now, I know we have a lot of listeners, and Dorena, they're so well-intentioned. They want to make sure they're having conversations with their children about race in ways that are empowering and important. And I think sometimes those conversations almost tend to going colorblind, right? Like not really trying to be as open about it, because nobody wants to say anything wrong. Nobody wants to be offensive. And so sometimes I find that with myself, with my friends, with whoever, we're almost, I'm afraid to say anything at all. Now, you've written a beautiful children's book called Colorful. And talk to us about how parents can talk to their kids and using tools like Colorful to really honor all of diversity without feeling so nervous or worried or feeling like you can't recognize any kind of differences between people. How do we do that as parents and be very honorable to everyone? How do we do that?
I encourage parents, first of all, to go back to our gospel foundation and realize that we are God's workmanship. When God created the heavens and the earth, and we read the Genesis story, and most of us who love and treasure the Word of God are faithfully teaching that to our children, starting when they're very, very young. And so we ourselves need to go back to our roots, look at those early chapters of Genesis, at how God created the earth and how intentional he was in creating a world of color. And that didn't stop when he created Adam and Eve. And then we look at Noah and his 3 sons, and we go to Abraham and how God said every family on the earth is going to be blessed through you. That's all nations, and we go literally through the biblical story. And of course, the redemption that Jesus provided at the cross, that whoever believes, that he loved all the world. The Great Commission to the disciples to go into all nations, all ethnos, and preach the gospel. And so, first of all, realizing that this was God's heart. This was always his heart. We have butchered God's intent. We have missed it. We have closed our eyes and our hearts and our ears, but we need to open them. And so it starts with us as adults, really, going back to our foundation, understanding that this was God's intent all along. This is what Jesus prayed for before he went to the cross in John 17, that we will be brought to complete unity. And this was God's heart. And so we need to have this passion because this was his passion. This is his passion. And he wants this to be fleshed out through us. And then apply yourselves to be students of what you do not know. That's humbling for parents. And I think this is a real hurdle sometimes because we feel like not just being parents, but being Sunday school teachers, being adults that teach and interact with children, aunts and uncles, we feel like we are supposed to know it all and have all the answers. And I think it's a beautiful posture and example to our children when they see us saying, mom and dad, auntie, grandmama, we are reading some books. I'm realizing so many things I don't know. There's a great big world full of information that is literally at our fingertips, at our Kindle opportunities and our libraries and our Christian bookstores. And so apply ourselves. There are so many amazing works that we can read, blogs that we can read, wonderful organizations online that we can join through social media as well, and avail ourselves of knowledge to reinform, to deconstruct what we learned incorrectly, to fill in those places that we realize I was never taught that, or I never knew that. It's humbling. I think that's why many of us don't do it, but we need to lean into that intentionality because with that, it will help us know how to move beyond the discomfort, which often comes from what we don't know or what we're unaccustomed to. So the intentionality of taking those steps ourselves. I would love for Colorful to be an intentional step for parents because it's an easy, very comfortable tool that also has the parent connection with questions that guide you and even beyond that sort of give you a launching pad to have great conversations about celebrating our skin color, celebrating that God has made people with different abilities, and even helping our children know not to feel awkward, to know what to say, for some of our precocious children, what not to say. But having those conversations is the first step, not staying in the land of, I don't know and I'm uncomfortable. We can stay there with lots of things in life and then we'll never move forward. We never get better and do better. So start taking those first steps. Yes, they're a little awkward. It may be uncomfortable, but lean into it. Nothing of worth or value is going to happen without putting forth effort.
And so as parents, as we're guiding our kids in these ways, how do you think is a great way to navigate when our children are noticing differences, whether that is ethnicity, whether that is someone who's differently abled, and they're going to ask those childlike questions. They may even ask them very loudly in the aisle of Target. So how do we, in that moment, how do we just help guide them in a way that honors their curiosity and at the same time begins to frame how we want to discuss these things? What are some great phraseologies? What are some things that really help equip children to honor? It's okay to notice differences, how to honor those differences, what their verbiage should be, and what our verbiage should be.
I would say to parents that this is why it's important that we do both. Sometimes our parenting is only reactive. And if it's only reactive, then that should be a trigger for us as a parent to say, okay, there are some things that I need to be talking about more at home or more in the car. If I'm only reacting to things that my kids are blurting, then I need to be having more conversations, or maybe they need to go deeper. And yes, we're going to have kids who blurt. Lord knows I had one in particular who did. And
every family needs one.
I wanted to just dig a hole and just drop down like, I can't believe she said that. And yet we encourage their curiosity. We encourage them to be critical thinkers. We encourage them to be discerning. And so in the moment, I would say to the parent to be as affirming as they can, especially if it's, for instance, they're noticing someone who's differently abled. Maybe there's a physical difference with someone's arm, something that's very noticeable, and your child says, what's wrong with that person? Don't use that moment and just turn them away as if you didn't notice that, because one, you're missing, especially as a believer, an opportunity to say something affirming to someone who is unfortunately accustomed so often to being isolated and being treated as less than. So speak up and say, I'm glad that you noticed that. And if that person seems approachable, maybe with your child, you could come closer. And often I've heard people who have a disability or a different ability or something that's noticeably different. I've heard them say, I don't mind kids asking questions. It's when they're treated by their parent or caregiver as if they're wrong to have that curiosity or there's something wrong with me. Mm-hmm. It heaps shame. So if it's a grocery store moment and you sense that maybe you can approach and maybe use it as an opportunity, and if that person says something that you have to go talk to your children about later, you are that primary person in their life and you always have opportunities to coat, those conversations again. But I would say lean in, don't turn them away as if there's something shameful, because you're triggering two things that are not necessary in that moment. And then I would also say, as soon as you get to the car, bring up that conversation. Cars are great opportunities to turn the radio off and engage, have those driving opportunities to engage conversations. It may even be after you've played at the playground and you notice that there were diverse children and maybe you saw your child continuing to look over at another child and you're paying attention to that. You're not on your phone or you're not just focused on your book, but you're watching, you're paying attention. Use the opportunity to say, I noticed that you were playing with, the kids on the playground. Wasn't that fun? And maybe get into their mind and begin to help them see that you care about the questions that they have, and even going before them and asking a question that prompts them to say, oh, it's okay to talk about that. I think it's harmful for our children when we place certain conversations in this category of we don't talk about that. And we sometimes don't say those words, or we don't talk about that. But in the way we emotionally interact or the way our body language interacts, that sends a message to your child that there's something wrong here. And that's not the message we want to be sending about affirming the humanity of people who may look different than us, whether that's, ethnically, whether that's in their physical makeup or what have you. And so use these as teachable moments. That's a challenge to us to continue to engage and to be aware and to be tuned in to what our children are paying attention to.
One of my daughters is identified as special needs. She has a significant hearing loss, but it's sort of, in a sense, invisible. You wouldn't really know to look at her unless you were able to spot her hearing aids, which she's always preferred to get really bright hearing aids, like bright red or purple ear molds or whatever. But one of my other daughters has left side hemiplegia, and so the left side of her body looks a bit different than the right side of her body. And it's been really interesting watching Mercy with other children. Mercy's 11 now. She does not mind at all discussing with kids who ask her about the left side of her body. And she's very open to chatting about what her story is and what happened to her. But I'm also interested at times because we have children say, what's wrong with the left side of your body? And I really appreciate the equipping you're giving listeners today. If we can just equip our kids to feel open to chatting, but maybe not to ask what's wrong. And I understand why children ask that. But Mercy does have kids in her life who have said, tell me about your left hand. Tell me about the left side of your body. And that's such a great opener because she's not starting from a place of being identified as wrong. She's being identified as someone who has a story to tell. And that has been very powerful for her when she gets to interact in that way. Back in a flash with this conversation about how to talk to our kids about differences in people. But first, I just have to tell you, it has been amazing the way our listeners have just rallied around and how many of you are choosing to sponsor a child in need through Compassion International.
Hi, my name is McKenna Jane Carr, and when I was 17 years old, I began sponsoring 2 children through Compassion International. I'm now in my mid-20s, and I'm still sponsoring those 2 kids who are now teenagers. I believe that decision has helped me to be intentional with my finances and has helped shape my approach to giving back to a broader world. I'd love for you to experience the same thing for just over $1 a day. Sponsor a child today at compassion.com/allmomdoes.
I recently had Katie Ganshard on. She's a fiction writer, and she has written a new book that's going to talk about this topic a little bit based on her experience in her family. She and her husband adopted a little girl from Africa, and her child also has some different abilities as part of her story. And Katie was talking about what we're seeing now in transracial families. So these are families where mom and dad may be of one racial background and kiddo may be of another. What are some of the things that you're seeing in your world about transracial families, the questions that kids are going to have, and how we can do a great job to come around and support those families as well? Because as Katie has said, you sort of don't fit in a lot of different populations. You know, once you open up your idea of family and you open your heart to international or domestic adoption that includes a child who is of a different race than your background. So what are you seeing in that space?
I love this thought of reminding parents that kids instinctively are going to think something's wrong, but something that's different than they are. And I think we almost need to take a deep breath and understand that that's our humanness that thinks if something's different, something must be wrong. And so that's a part of our continued training. And I keep going back to the conversations that we need to be having at home, because so many of us, especially as Christian parents, we get that. We look at Deuteronomy and we understand how Moses was inspired by the Holy Spirit to write, when your children ask you, what does this mean? What do these stones mean? Remind them of how God brought you out of slavery. And so anticipate the questions that your children are going to ask and have answers ready. And so I think that's a challenge for us as parents. In our world with transracial families, I hear beautiful stories. I hear painful stories, and I hear them simultaneously. I hear parents who are loving the opportunity to affirm to their children who look different than them that, yes, we look different, which comes right in the face of this prevailing discussion of colorblindness and why it's so important that that is not what we teach, because it's not truthful and it's harmful. And so parents need to understand that colorblindness is harmful and it's not truthful. So there's something better, and that is to teach them to embrace, the colorful world, as I wrote in my book. But these parents are engaging on a daily basis, whether it's, putting a Band-Aid on their child, and that's a moment to notice the color of the Band-Aid. If they don't have flesh-colored ones, to notice that difference. Or it's, doing hair, and why is my hair texture different from yours? Unfortunately, preschool kids, even in our church, are subject to kids of color, have white kids say, I don't play with brown. And that comes from somewhere. And so that beautiful dark brown or mocha brown child is then having to go back to their parents, if they're white parents, and try to understand why was that said about me? And that parent has to do the tough job of continuing to try to deflect off of their child's sense of self-worth, that there's nothing wrong with you. That child, unfortunately, may not have the opportunity to play with kids who are different than he or she is. And so when they play with someone different, they automatically think that's wrong, whether they're in a home that's specifically, unfortunately, teaching them, whether it's white supremacy or whether it's just that other people who are unlike us are less than. And we know that kind of teaching, unfortunately, is even prevalent in our church communities. And so that's why it's so important as parents that from the time our children use words, we are affirming the worth and the imago Dei in every person, and that we're teaching that to our children, of course, beginning at home with our own children, but we're also reminding them that applies to every person. And if we keep reiterating that, I pray we could raise a generation of kids who don't approach people who look different than them, whether that's racially different or whether that's having a different ability, and think there's something wrong, but instead approach them with a curiosity and an openness to learn, as you said, what their story is, because we all have a story. And I think that's such a beautiful approach, that we can be intentional in having that passion to lay a foundation that our children can launch from in a way that really reflects the beauty of God's diverse kingdom.
And so Colorful is your children's book that's come out about celebrating all of the iterations of color that God has put into the world. And your new book, Thoughtful, is going to be about discovering the unique gifts in each of us. And it is going to include a child who is differently abled. So what was your inspiration for Thoughtful?
I am sitting here looking at it right now, and I just feel so blessed when I consider this book is inspired by my amazingly thoughtful nephew, Josiah. He is gifted with Down syndrome, and in many conversations over his 10 years of life with my sister and her husband and their family, and with other wonderful children that I've had the opportunity to interact with who have different abilities, it has been a reminder to me that God has made each of us with our unique gifts. And so often the gifts that we have may not be visible. And yet I believe it's important to teach that. And for us as adults even, because truth be told, these are lessons not just for kids, but they're also for us as adults.
Yep.
And so I want my sweet little native boy, Ahanu, who is the boy with Down syndrome, I wanted him to be the hero. I wanted him to be the one that we look up to. And he shows the children in the story how to be full of kind thoughts by his example, by the way he interacts with his friends, and the way that his gifts and his abilities are apparent, the way that he's a strong painter, and the way that he comforts other children who are down, and the way that the illustrators just brought those words to life. I really wanted it to display Jesus's kingdom principles that he spoke all through the Gospels about: the first shall be last and the last shall be first. I wanted Ahanu to be the first in this story, and to remind all of us that our different abilities are God-given. And just like the body of Christ is made up of eyes and hands and arms and feet. And as the word tells us that we don't say, the eye doesn't say to the hand, I don't need you. 1 Corinthians 12, the kidney is vitally important, but we don't see it. So the pieces and the parts that aren't seen are also valuable just as much as the parts that are big, like the leg, or the parts that are loud and small, like the mouth. I'm excited for Thoughtful to be released, and excited for children and adults to just embrace the unique gifts that we all have, and to be like Ahanu, to be full of kind thoughts towards others.
Now, we may have some parents listening, some listeners who say, it's my intention to be thoughtful and kind and compassionate, but do I have some areas where I'm very uncomfortable, or I realize I've got some dialogues running through my head, maybe from the way I was raised or the region of the country I was raised in or whatever, that I'm walking forward with some issues about race or about the way I treat people who are differently abled, how I think of them. What is a way that can be redeemed for a mom and a dad listening today who wants to do better by their own kids, who wants to walk in greater compassion and open-heartedness, but is struggling with what their upbringing had been, or things that have just kind of snuck in terms of a dialogue in their head? What are some things that they can do for themselves to get themselves in the right place to then model for their kids what it means to live like Jesus really wants us to live in relationship with others?
I would say to that mom and dad, first of all, you are not alone. And that's a lie that the enemy sows to our minds to isolate us and to feel like everybody else is fine and no one else is going through this struggle but me. We all were raised by imperfect parents, all of us, and we are imperfect parents. And so we all have to deconstruct. We all have to look at what we were taught and how we were taught and from whom we were taught. And so that is a worthy journey, and it is one that I would encourage their intentionality. I would encourage them that it is going to be painful. Sometimes we want to negate the fact that we're going to have to go through hardship, but the Bible tells us to endure hardship as a good soldier. And so it is a painful journey for all of us. And for some people, as their awareness is coming in a huge wave, like a tsunami, it feels overwhelming. But this is a worthy journey, and it's one that God calls us to take as we deconstruct, as we unpack, as we come to terms with our own bias. And we all have bias, every person of every ethnicity, every color. It's easy to focus on other people and say, well, if only they, or to deflect, but to resist those very human tendencies, and instead to remain humble and teachable and ask the Lord to convict your heart and ask Him to give you wisdom as you learn things that you need to learn. And again, I encourage the use of so many wonderful resources. Be the Bridge organization has great resources. I'm a small group leader with that organization, and it's all about intentionality, really coming alongside of us as adults to really unpack and grow in racial justice. And so take the journey and talk about it with your children, especially your kids who are a little bit older, maybe in elementary or even middle school. Talk to your children, show them the books that you're reading, and tell them some summaries about what's blowing your mind or maybe what's grieving you. How powerful that is to our children, who we're commending their learning and we're commending their critical thinking, to again model to them that you are also on that journey. How powerful would that be for sons to hear that from fathers, and daughters from mothers, and vice versa, that I am learning some things that I never knew. And have your kids say, well, what are you learning? Tell me about it. Share, not from a posture of, well, I know it all, but I don't know, but I'm learning. And what an encouragement that would be to your children. So I would say to parents, take the journey. It's not easy. It's not supposed to be, but it is worth it. You're not alone. And on the other side of this phase, of this chapter, will be wonderful lessons that will just reinforce the gospel truth, not just for your heart, but for your children and for the kingdom of God, for the witness of God to come.
And I think that you bring up such great news, Dorena, which is there are amazing resources out there. You can connect with Dorena at DorenaWilliamson.com. You'll learn more about her work as a bridge builder, an author, a mom, all the incredible things she's doing. And I'd love to connect with you too. You can go to JulieLylesCarr.com or on all the socials. I'm Julie Lyles Carr. And I would also love for you to check out my book, Raising an Original. Every week, the only way that this thing comes all together is because we have just the best producer and the best content coordinator. That's Donna Todi and Rebecca Beckett. Let them know how much you appreciate them. And check out AllMomDoes.com. It is a blog specifically for you in this season of your life with all you have going on, the questions, the concerns, the different challenges that we face as women today. You're going to find all kinds of resources and equipping and all kinds of great stuff and community at AllMomDoes.com and also on the socials, Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, All Mom Does. Coming up next week, hey, I want a marriage that's great, but I even like this phrase a little bit better. What about a fierce marriage? What about that? Next week, we're going to be talking with Selena Frederick, and she has some really amazing ideas on not just how to make your marriage good, but how to make it fierce. That's coming up on the Modern Motherhood Podcast.